Roddy Doyle, welcome. It's a
Thank you.
huge pleasure and honor to have you join us, and thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Roddy, do you think you could start with that excerpt that I pointed out?
Yeah, sure, if you want. It comes quite late in the first novel, The Woman Who Walked Into Doors. Um, and Paula Spencer is the narrator of her own story in this particular novel. We'd been getting along fine, chatting away about the world and the H blocks. It was nice. The trick was to agree with everything he said. Then he came out with it. Where'd you get that? What? The eye. It was a test. I was thumping inside. He was playing with me. There was only one right answer. I walked into the door. Is that right? Yeah. Looks sore. It's not too bad. Good. He was messing with me, playing, like a cat with an injured bird, with his black armband, the fucker. Keeping me on my toes, keeping me in my place, pretending he didn't remember. Pretending he'd never seen black and red and in that eye before, pretending he cared. I didn't believe he'd forgotten, not even for a second. He wanted me to think that, or that he was sick, having blackouts, that he was like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a schizophrenic, that I should feel sorry for him and try to understand. I didn't believe it. He was playing with me, ruining the night because it was getting too cozy. Only playing. He had me. I could say nothing. I could never fight back. When he wasn't hitting me, he was reminding me that he could. He was reminding me and getting me ready, like the cat playing with the bird, letting it live a bit longer before he killed it. He put one of his fingers on the bruise. I made sure I stayed absolutely still. I looked ahead, at the telly. The tip of his finger was freezing. He rested it gently under my eye. You must have walked right into it, did you? Yeah, I wasn't looking. Which door? Bedroom. He took his finger away. I could still feel it on my cheekbone. Were you drinking? No. Sure? Yeah. Just careless? Yeah. Okay. I waited for more. I sat beside him and waited.
So that's one of the references to doors. There's references to doors all through all the books, really.
Yes. Doors seem to have a very strong pull in my writing. They have a symbolic quality. You come up to a closed door or a locked door. Some people are allowed in, others aren't. So it's a very useful image, symbol to have. More than that, though, I think because despite the fact I'm talking to you in front of quite a few people, and that I've spoken to hundreds of people and quite content to do it, I'm actually quite shy. And the idea of walking up to a closed door and just opening it and walking in, is a horrible prospect for me.
Hmm.
I've been in the company of other people who just march up and open the door and walk in, and I really admire it. I envy it, actually, but I've never been able, never would be able to do that. But when I started writing the novel and started thinking about Paula in the home, um, not being able to drive, for example, so she can't drive away, pack the car with the kids and get away, not having any academic or technical qualifications, nothing that could get her a job that would allow her to support the family. That comes later. And the door seems to be a much more profound thing to walk up to. The consequences of opening the door and walking out are frightening. And so the door was useful. And I remember it said, I can't remember whether I read it or whether I'd heard it said, it was a common excuse or a common story told in hospital A&E's accident and emergencies by women. I walked into a door. So it was an obvious in many, many ways, an obvious tool to use in terms of the writing. That sounds a bit brutal, but I'm telling a story, and the story has to be, given what the nature of it, has to be brutal. And so Paula would have used this. I walked into a door many, many times. I suppose the surprise is that she uses it to her husband, who knows full well that actually it was him who hit her. That's
Hmm.
why she's bruised.
Hmm. And the door for me was had a very important part because I had run behind a door to escape from him and
Mhm.
locked it just in time. And he was breaking it down to get to me. And he actually did break through the door. But I had called 911 and I pressed the button at the second that he went through. And so the door was cracked. But then I put it out there to people, does anybody, for survivors, do you have any door stories? And they did. They had a lot of door
Mm.
stories and door photos.
Yes. It doesn't surprise me. Do you know, it doesn't surprise me at all. So, yeah, I don't know if I've anything to add about the door and the importance of the door. Um, then in the third book, The Women Behind the Door, which takes place during the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, the door has a different quality in a way. It allows Paula and her daughter refuge, being behind the door and having, because Paula tells the rest of the world that they have contracted COVID, so have to go into quarantine for 10 days, the two of them together, they're able to stay behind the door and use that time to have excruciating conversations with each other, uninterrupted by people who would normally be in their social circle or would normally be texting them or phoning them or coming through the door. Nobody can. So funnily enough, it operates in a different way in the third book. More benign, I suppose, because Paul is in charge. Paul is in control of the door, but she never loses her fear. Walking up to the door from the inside, she never loses. It's the muscle memory. She never loses that fear of approaching the door and the
Mhm.
consequences of it. I never, in my growing up in the house I grew up in, I never witnessed anything like this. Um, I remember my parents having an argument once, and perhaps I remember it because it was the only time I think I ever heard them arguing. Um, I never saw my father hit my mother or my mother hit my father. I don't think it ever happened. Um, Now, granted, I wasn't there all the time, but they seemed to love each other, and more importantly, perhaps in many, many ways, to really like each other's company. So I had never witnessed violence in the home. Um, but going right back, when I wrote my first three novels, which are set in a working class household in Dublin, it's one of the stories about a young woman who's pregnant, and the baby is actually lucky to be born into that household. It's chaotic and packed, but it's an emotionally very successful house. But while I was writing those books, particularly the third one, I was thinking this isn't necessarily the reality in every home. So I began to wonder about the neighbours. And that's where the Spencers, the Paula Spencer, Charlo Spencer, her husband, the children. That's really the germ of the idea that if I kept on writing about the, if you like, the emotionally successful home, it would become a bit shrill and a bit insistent. This is working class life or this is family life. And I didn't want to do that.
Well, Roddy,
And
can
at the
I
same
ask you, can I ask you, when we first corresponded in 2019, you told me that some domestic abuse victims, survivors who had read The Woman Who Walked Into Doors said, "How did you get into my fucking head?" And you said that
yeah,
was the best review you ever got. But I really
yeah.
want to know, how did you get into the woman's Paula's head? So you were
Well,
in my head, like you were in my head, and you're a man. So, how did you do that?
well, to a degree, I'd start off by saying the most trite thing, really, but it's actually absolutely honest. It's my job. And I don't mean that in any kind of sinister way. It's my job to find the words that describe what's happening to other people. Even if I was writing something, and I often do something inspired by personal experience, I still have to find the words that capture it, you know? Now, it's much harder, obviously, if I'm describing something way beyond my experience. But there are ways of getting closer. I got to know Paula. I was invited by the BBC to write a four-part television series. And I decided to write it became, the title was eventually Family. And I decided to write about the family next door to the rabbit family who had been in my first three novels. And I gave the man a name, Charlo. I gave one of the sons a name, John Paul. I gave the daughter a name, Nicola. And then the final episode, I gave the woman a name, Paula. And each episode was devoted to a different family member. And by the time I got to Paula's episode, I already knew a good deal about her. And the final episode then is the least dramatic. Nothing particularly happens in the final episode except her coping. And when I finished writing it, sometime I'd say 1992, and filming started in 1993, I began to wonder about Paula. The television series was confined to a couple of months in their lives, and I wondered about her life before that, when, you know, going back 17 years when she'd met the man who became her husband, what those 17 years had been like, going further back, what her childhood had been like, what her family life had been like, and then wondering what the next few years were going to be like. And that's where the novel came from, because I was curious to get to know Paula better.
But Roddy, so you mean the TV show was about domestic abuse? Was it chronicling the domestic abuse that Paula was going through?
Yes, yeah, yeah. There's very little from the TV show in the novel. I did it in reverse in a way. Normally, you look at a TV program, as a miniseries or whatever, it's often based on a novel or based on a book. I was the opposite. I wrote the television series and then wrote a book. It wasn't a novelization. I didn't go through the 4 episodes. I had no interest in doing that. I began to imagine Paula having thrown her husband out, and actually he's dead. I began to imagine her sitting at the kitchen table when her children were a bit older than they are in the novel, than they are in the television series. They're at school. She has time, she has the intelligence and the resilience to just sit and fill copybooks with her thoughts and with her story. And I began to assemble it that way. I began to imagine myself as her. I began to imagine her schooling, for example. The eccentricity of some of the teachers wasn't 100 miles away from the eccentricity of the teachers I encountered at high school level. I went to a Christian Brothers school, and to say it was strange is to really put it mildly.
Roddy, do you think that there was, I know that Christian Brothers has been, you hear about the sexual assault of the students, which you think that was going on then at that school, your school that you were in?
It did, not to me. There was a lot of brutality. Corporal punishment was the norm. It didn't become illegal until I think I was in my second year as a high school teacher myself, 1981, I think, when a corporal punishment became illegal in the Republic of Ireland. A few years before it happened in the UK, by the way. But it was the norm. Delivered with more enthusiasm by some teachers than with others, and there was definitely. I remember being really severely beaten by a lay teacher, and I remember thinking to myself, and it was really, really painful, humiliating. I remember thinking to myself, but not being able to articulate it or to understand it, and I certainly wasn't going to tell my parents when I got home. There was something more than punishment going on there. The way the man was sweating, the grunting, there was some sort of sexual aspect.
That's weird.
But there were other boys who were sexually abused, but I didn't know. I didn't know it at the time. It may not have. I don't know exactly the years these boys were in, but it did happen. But not to me.
Roddy, can I ask you, well, thank goodness for that. Can I ask you, So Ireland, we hear a lot of stories about the drinking, alcoholism, and there is that, of course, in Paula Spencer's books. But I don't think we hear quite as much about domestic abuse in Ireland. Could you tell me about what you felt back when you wrote The Woman Who Walked Into Doors? Were you aware of the domestic abuse that was happening, if it was related to drinking? And do you think that there was a lot of it in
I
Ireland?
don't know. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there was. I mean, I don't know how many when the novel came out, and particularly the television series had a bigger impact than any novel ever could. Um, it was at a time before, there were all the options that we would have now about how many programs we can record and watch and binge on and that sort of thing. People sat in Ireland on Tuesdays in May 1994 when it was broadcast. Half the adult population in the Republic of Ireland sat and watched it at the same time. Episode one. More watched it the second episode, more the third, and more again the fourth. So more than half the adult population in the country, presumably a lot of their kids as well, watched that television show at the same time. You could never expect anything like that, remotely like that, with a novel. Oh, I wish to Christ half the adult population bought one of my novels. I'd be a happy camper, but it's never going to happen. Or, if even half 1% of the population bought a book, I'd be chuffed. But
So did that
that's the
really
type
get
of
it? Did that,
impact it had. And more, I don't know how many women told me I thought I was the only one because it was kind of kept secret. It's perceived as such a shameful thing. And the pressure within the family to keep it quiet, not say anything, not do anything about it must have been overwhelming. I'd like to think that times are more open now. We've advanced a lot. The television series was broadcast in 92. I think divorce was introduced in 1996. And and other social changes have come along as well. We've become a much more open society, but domestic violence is. I was told recently we don't use the term domestic violence anymore, but to me it's a very useful term.
what do we use? What do they use?
Well, I was told it's intimate partner violence, but I wondered that doesn't quite capture all the other violence inside the house.
Mm-hmm. I like the word terrorizing.
Yeah. I suppose it wasn't used here because we had terrorists of a different kind operating at that time
right.
in the north of Ireland and, on the borders. You were asking about alcohol. I honestly don't know if there's a link in Ireland. I'm not sure if the statistics bear out the notion that we drink more than they do elsewhere.
That is the reputation.
That might be a bit of a cliche. It certainly was the kind of racist depiction of Irish people in Britain at one point. They were charming and feckless and drunk and unreliable and good for a laugh, but don't expect them to turn up to work on time. This is before it slowly dawned, I think, on the population of the UK that actually the standard of living in Ireland was higher than it was in the UK, so they can't be that reckless and useless and hopeless.
Roddy, if you could talk about the alcoholism of Paula Spencer that you really get into in the second book. And there's a woman I met who did a documentary on her mother, and she said that the whole family, her mother ended up falling into a canal. They found out that the autopsy, she was drunk when it happened, and her whole family wrote her off as this alcoholic. But her daughter said that it was because of the father's abuse, because she remembers when she was 7 and the father almost killed the mother and the mother fled with her. And then also in one of your books, and I mean, look, I just can't find the passages that I want because I've done this to all 3 of yours. But one of the passages you talk about how she started drinking to numb the pain from the domestic abuse. So do you feel like that the alcoholism stemmed for Paula Spencer from the domestic abuse that she was going through?
I would imagine so. I mean, I think at one point she starts drinking really to keep him company. It's something that they have in common. It's quite a common. It used to be quite a common story. A couple meet and they go to the pub, and they sometimes their meetings revolve around the pub. Few drinks before going to a movie, few drinks after the movie, then it becomes a few drinks and more drinks. I'm not saying that's the case with everybody, but anyway, she kind of drinks socially with them to keep them company and hoping in a way that they have that in common.
Oh, the wedding night. When she had all this fantasy about a romantic wedding night, and he
Yeah,
just gets plastered, and he doesn't even come into bed with her on the wedding
yeah,
night.
he's
So
with his
they're all just,
mates. He doesn't really make the transition from bachelor to partner in any real sense at all. Um, anyway, she becomes addicted to alcohol. It happens, as far as I know, it happens to some people easier than it does to others. There was a legendary footballer, Irish footballer called George Best, whose career ended very, very early. And it turns out, well, one of the reasons was he was an alcoholic. His mother, I read some time ago, was in her 50s before she had a drink. She had a drink and she was dead within a couple of years. It was as if it was waiting for her. And so Paula, yes, she's so addled, confused, battered, lacking anything in the way of self-confidence that alcohol numbs it. It numbs it. And
yeah,
then she has the battle and the lucky and the goods and she wins it. Because in by the third book, the threat of alcohol is always there, but I think it's safe to say she's in control. She can be in the company of two women, for example, who have a glass of wine, and she doesn't feel any sort of a need to join them, or to wonder what it's like, or try to remember what it's like, the exhilaration of the first glass. Um, so yes, one of the women when I finished writing the novel, a group of women from an organisation called Women's Aid here in Ireland, uh, they all gathered. I'd sent them manuscripts, copies of the novel. This before I could send them a PDF or anything like that. So I met them then, a group of about 10 women around a table in the headquarters of Women's Aid. And one of them asked, did she have to be an alcoholic? And I started, yeah, and I said, yeah, no, she didn't have to be an alcoholic, but I just felt that, you know, she probably would become an alcoholic. And the other women were nodding. They were agreeing. They were wishing that she didn't have to be an alcoholic. But at the same time, they were agreeing that, it's not a certainty, but it's a possibility that she would become an alcoholic or dependent on alcohol. Her medicine, for example.
and Roddy, could I ask you, guilt? That's a word that you use a lot. Do you feel that that it belongs on her, that she should feel guilty?
No, no. Um, It's interesting that in throughout the books, particularly the first one, if you look, and it's not exactly as it's 100 years ago, it's set, just slightly more than 30 years ago, that the idea of going to some sort of a therapist doesn't occur. You know, I don't think she should feel guilty. Or if she does feel guilty, I think she put it in context. I mean, we all far, all of us who are parents, I mean, we all make a mess of things now and again, sometimes constantly. I mean, we probably carry a load of guilt on our backs throughout the average human life. So there's plenty of it. When you grow up in a country that at the time was kind of rigorously Catholic and sort of
Oh,
you,
yes,
you
guilt from
encounter you tasted guilt before you tasted ice cream in this country when I was growing up. So there's no shortage of it. But no, I don't think she should. I don't think it's useful. I mean, it's easy for me to say, but it's not in any way useful in her recovery to feel burdened by guilt, or useful for her children, because I think they have to. I mean, by all means, if she feels the need, as she does in the third book, to apologize and try to explain, and has to listen to her daughter, really, I suppose, in some senses, for the first time, all these years later. But guilt, as I understand it, it just gets in the way, really.
Well, it does get in the way. And the interesting thing is just talking to so many survivors of domestic abuse. For some reason, guilt is just a very, very strong feeling when you're in domestic abuse. Like I was guilty all the time. I just felt guilty with my,
Yes.
I don't know what felt guilty about looking back on it,
Mhm.
but it's something they do to you to just make you feel guilty.
Well, it's something I encountered. I read. I mean, I didn't do much formal research when I was writing the book. I just thought about the woman herself, Paula, trying to imagine what she felt. And it's extraordinary how many women would have blamed themselves. What did I do wrong? I wasn't available to him sexually, or I wasn't available to him sexually in that way. I made a mess at the dinner. It wasn't on time. I demanded too much of him. I wouldn't keep the kids quiet so he could sleep when he came home after work in a shift. All these excuses for pulling your fist back and hitting somebody, you know. So yeah, if you feel bad, sometimes the automatic follow up to that is that I must be bad.
Yes,
You
and
know,
so Roddy, you didn't talk to any domestic abuse victim survivors in
no,
writing the book?
no,
Wow.
uh, I didn't. If you like, put it this way, uh, I didn't know at times if I was talking to a victim. I knew after the television series was broadcast that I knew more people who'd been victims than I ever thought because they told me. But I didn't go looking, I didn't research it too much. As you know, I'm a novelist, and it was important to me to try and make it up, to try and find Paula's words. I didn't want it in any way to be worthy, um, because very often worthy, correct writing can also be a bit tedious. And I wanted the success of the novel to be based on me finding Paula's words.
Wait, did you say worthy
So
or wordy?
worthy,
Oh, what do you mean?
Worthy,
What do you mean by that?
well intentioned, um, well intentioned, and you know, if it's well intentioned, the tendency is go for the happily ever after because you'd wish that on everybody, wouldn't you? You'd wish everybody to be to live happily ever after. And of course, living happily ever after in many senses just isn't available because, you know, ever after, you know, even the tech guys who are trying to become immortal are finding it doesn't, there are difficulties with that. You know, we're not immortal, so ever after doesn't exist. So I wanted to make sure that I was staying, I put on blinkers, so to speak, the Paula blinkers, and I went like that as I was writing, and I didn't accept things coming to my left or my right or information, research. Now and again, I'd come across a phrase that I thought was useful, or I'd already heard a phrase, or something had happened. I was a high school teacher for 14 years, so I was in the company of hundreds of young people, teenagers, 5 days a week, all year. And you can't help but hear things, sometimes they deliver a glorious, funny story. Other times you look at a child and you wonder the grey face, the threadbare uniform, um, the tiredness of the eyes, and it feeds your imagination. But to put it mildly, not just your imagination. So I relied on my ability to create the story.
So just a passage here. If I want to get into the Nicola and Paula relationship and how she was the parentification. Are you familiar with, do you use that word? That's what I sort of think about it when my daughter and I went to therapy for the first time, family therapy. That's what the therapist pointed out. She said that in a mother-daughter, the daughter's here, the mother's there, but with domestic abuse,
Mm-hmm.
it's flipped. And I did absolutely feel like my daughter was the mother to me, and you
Mm-hmm.
absolutely nailed that. And then even a passage like this in Paula Spencer, where you say, she's talking about, Paula's talking about Nicola, the little girl who danced. Oh, it's actually Leanne. The little girl who danced around the kitchen, trying to distract her father, trying to charm him away from her mother's broken body. Like how many times, but how I related to that is how many times I would send my daughter where my husband was to try to get him to be in a better mood, but how did you get that? Like just things like that, where you didn't talk to domestic abuse survivors. Like I just can't even understand how you understood all of this.
Well, there is an honest answer to a lot of the questions I'm asked as a writer, and the answer is I don't know. That, it is an honest answer. Luckily, it's not the only answer because we'd have great difficulty filling an hour and a quarter if I keep giving that particular honest answer. But if I am going to answer the question, it has to be with the I don't know. Some of it, I just, I put these children, these four individuals, they're all very different. Because they all go through a particular experience, they don't come out identical versions of the same child who's been, as sometimes statistics would suggest that, and I hate, for example, the whole bracketing of people in generations, Gen Z and Gen X and Gen this, that. I don't see people that way. And I'm sure there are tendencies within Gen X or whatever, but I think it robs people of their individuality, So I could see the children reacting in different ways. I saw John Paul as having asthma, and his inhaler was needed. Without giving too much away, there was asthma in our household when my kids were small. I could see Nicola as being more, I suppose, serene isn't quite the word, but more collected, more in control of herself than her little sister, her younger sister, Leanne, was. And then there was the little lad, Jack. And I really didn't get to know Jack at all because he was just that little presence in the corner watching all this. Too young to really express anything about it. But I began to get a clearer picture of all these kids. And Leanne would, as I said, try to charm her dad into a good mood. I probably observed versions of that in my childhood. My father was a very gentle man, a very funny, nice man, really. Years later, after he died, I grew up on the edge of a big housing estate, and it was like a building site for years of my life. And then I ended up teaching in the same estate. And years after my father was dead, and people would come up to me and say, your dad, they'd give me a story about something really kind that my father had done. Nothing big or spectacular. And it wasn't about flinging money around because he didn't have it. It was more about giving them time and giving them attention and trying to sort something small for them. And so that was my dad. But I'm sure there were times when he came home from work and was quiet and wasn't, the burden of whatever happened that working day came home with him. And I must have watched. I'm certainly, perhaps my younger brother, perhaps one of my sisters, trying to get him to look up and become their dad again.
Yeah.
I'm sure it happened. And I'm saying that without any bitterness, because as I said, he was a really nice man. I mean, I couldn't have asked for a nicer father in many, many ways. But I'm sure it happened. This is what the eldest child has a role, the youngest child. And, when I'm talking about child, I'm taking for granted. When I was growing up, you took for granted it was never a child in the house. It was children, you know, when the doors opened where I lived, the children poured out of the place. I mean, there were four of us. There were five, but there were four of us who lived, and that was a relatively small group. You know,
Yeah.
the place was awash with kids. So I'm sure I watched all this, and you'd go around the back of the house and open the back door of most houses, you know, whenever, and just walk into their kitchen, and all these parents, all these different personalities, all the clearly households that were bright. There was music on the radio. Others, not so much so.
But you don't remember any families or that you felt that something was going wrong there, that the father was especially brutal or
Yeah, I always remind myself when I'm thinking these things that I was a child. I wasn't, you know, a smaller version of my adult self looking through the back window. But there were fathers who struck me as being not particularly nice men. And now and again he'd be walking by, I'd hear roaring and shouting. But I'd never. I did learn years later that one of the guys I would have known, one of the fellows I probably played football with, was deaf in one ear because of he was hit by his father. I didn't know that at the time, and it may be the case that he didn't know that at the time. But that was the case. And looking back on that household, yeah, all was not well in that house. But that's what the benefit of, if you like, experience and the benefit of an adult set of eyes looking back. At the time, no more than I knew things were happening in the school I went to, not the school I taught in, but the school I went to. But if he'd asked me to explain what was going on, outside of the jokes that the kids told to each other and outside of a few words that we knew but probably didn't understand, I wouldn't have had the language to explain what was going on. So, but any novelist, any writer, anybody who does things creatively, you bring a lifetime of language with you and a lifetime of things that you've seen or sensed, and without even knowing it, most of the time you delve into that.
Roddy, did you know that? I mean, there were like 10 years in between each of the books. When did you know that you were going to write more about Paula Spencer?
Um, the first book was 1996, I think it came out, and I remember around about 2004, thereabouts, I'd been writing a novel that was set in the past. In the meantime, things had changed so quickly in Ireland. The place was awash with money. There were helicopters in the sky, and I was reading about, you know, people who were buying helicopters instead of a big car these days, talking about, you know, vast amounts of money. And I thought I'd like to write a novel around these changes, this new place it seemed to be. And I didn't want it to be satirical because I don't like satire much. And I think it's often a lazy way of looking at the world. But I thought to myself, Paula is cleaning the houses of some of these people. She's cleaning offices. Um, in the first book, she was cleaning with other women from the area she lived in, and it was her social life. She'd meet them at the local train station, the commuter station, and go into the city centre. 10 years later, with Paula Spencer, the second book, she's still cleaning, but she's now working with women from Africa and Eastern Europe. The Irish women aren't doing it anymore. And I thought she'd be a good observer because she wouldn't be bitter. She'd be amused by a lot of it. Her sister's drinking wine, for example. Her sister's talking about buying apartments in Bulgaria, which happened, you know. So that was the second book. It just struck me, I'll get Paula to tell this story. And I said, it'll be a year in her life, a year of observations. And that's what happened. The third book, I hadn't planned it. It's more than 10 years. It's closer to 20 years, I'd say, between the second book and the third one. I suppose there's a lot of living involved. you go from being, say, when I wrote the first book, I was the father of two children. When I started the book, a toddler and a baby. Years later, I've got three children, and they're not children anymore. They're adults. And there's an awful lot of living there. There's an awful lot of watching and being involved in the rearing of children, and things to go right and things to go wrong, tension, joy, all these things. And my mother was 92 when she died, you know. So I remember at the time her health was very, very good until the last few months when it really declined badly. And watching my siblings and myself trying to look after my mother, it was like the roles were reversed. Um, and one of my older siblings was herself a pensioner by the time my mother died. So it was a child who's actually a pensioner looking after her mother. And this inevitably, we emptied the house then because my father was dead, emptied the house, and the place was, they'd always lived in the same house. They moved into it in 1951. So the place was full of things that I grew up with, books on the bookshelves, pictures on the wall, the dimensions of the kitchen. It was all so familiar. And gradually we're emptying the house and it stops being a home and becomes just a building, you know. And I think I brought a lot of that with me into the book,
Mhm.
the relationship between parents and their children as the children grow older, the um, the things we recall, the things that shape us, the things that perhaps we feel warp us, the attention that some kids get and others don't seem to get, and that's the way they feel. So the resentments, all these things, I began to think there's a book here, and then the drama of the whole COVID and pandemic experience, the lock, being locked up and not being able to contact people. I just thought, um, there's an opportunity here.
And the way that Paula said that with COVID, restrictions weren't new to her because she was used to restrictions.
Yeah, yeah.
I do want to welcome Betsy Cornwell, who is going to be Ring of Salt. I don't know, Roddy, if you've read that yet, but she's going to be a March guest with
Um,
her wonderful book, Ring of Salt. And Diane Rosenfeld is here, and we invited her. She was a guest on our book club with the Bonobo Sisterhood. And she says, hi, all. Roddy, it's such an honor, huge honor to meet you and hear from you. I've assigned your book, The Woman Who Walked Into Doors, before in classes. She's the head of the gender violence program at Harvard. You
oh,
are such a brilliant writer, so compassionate and profound. Thank you, and
thank
my
you.
very best wishes for your continued voice ringing through this world. Um,
Thank you.
and
Thank
um,
you.
and then, of course, in the book, what's so interesting too is about how between Carmen and Paula, when Carmen it sounds like she was sexually abused by her father, and
Mm,
Paula doesn't want to hear about it, and she has her
mm,
fantasies about her growing up and how it was a great childhood. But there is a passage about when Carmen, I won't be able to find it now, but when Carmen talks to her about, don't you remember like what he did to mom? You know, so he was abusing her. Her father was abusive to her mother too.
yeah. Um, yeah. I don't know if I can offer much there. I think it's one way of looking at it. It's kind of interesting when you're listening to other people. Group of friends, for example, all of us recalling something that happened, and it's really interesting how if there's four people present, there are four different recollections. There might be 50% of it might be common to the four people, but the other 50% we kind of make it up. And Paula refuses, I think, in some ways, to recall that her father was not a nice man in many, many ways. Monosyllabic, sorry, brutish. Um, it may well be that psychologically she needs that childhood, that happy childhood to prop her up, that it wasn't always brutal. Carmel, the older sister, remembers it differently. Carmel doesn't actually, if I remember right, now I haven't read the book since it came out, but Carmel, if I'm remembering right, doesn't actually state that she was sexually abused.
Right, right.
Do you know?
Was she? You know, so
I know as much as you know.
okay,
All that exists is in the book.
okay. Well, it
There's
seems to
nothing
me that she
else.
was. Yeah, but she doesn't
Yeah.
actually state. That's correct.
Yeah.
Um, I also do want to mention Solus Nua is a partner. Are you familiar with? You know about Solus Nua, right, Roddy? The
But I know what it means, new light.
yes. So they're Washington
It's
D.C.
showing
based.
off there my knowledge of Gaelic.
Oh, it's Gaelic. Yeah, they're
It
Washington
is.
D.C. based, and they bring the best of contemporary Irish arts to the U.S. And they are a partner of ours. Um, so there is a comment back when you were talking about how you were reluctant to open doors yourself, and then my daughter Jackie actually mentioned that it's interesting throughout the book how there's so many. It's a lot of times where the people are not opening doors. I can't find the comment, but and then just this
Well, of course,
past
it's a class thing as well, because there you'll find that, working class people have more doors closed as they come up to them than middle class people do.
true, 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 true,
If we go beyond the literal interpretation of the door, so the door operates in that way as well.
true. And also, Mary Lou is here, and Mary Lou is 85, and she and I have been doing this book club from the beginning. And she and I talk a lot about how the door was there, like the doorknob was there. We could have opened it. It's not like we were
Mhm.
chained, but we didn't. So that's so interesting, right? That the door, it's
Yeah.
the door is so interesting for that too, because you're all you need to do is turn the knob and open it, but we didn't do it, and we just felt we couldn't.
Hmm. Yeah, and
Um,
I had no real difficulty putting myself in that position when I was imagining Paula, not from any fear of, from my childhood. Do you know, do you know that phrase, the door was always open? Well, it kind of was in our house. Um, this is, very warm, very pleasant, very uh, reluctant to say happy because happiness is a big burden to carry. Are you happy? Were you happy? I mean, occasionally, yeah, the notion of being happy all the time is so close to unbearable, I'd imagine. But it was a good house to grow up in. So, um, yeah, I don't know. I don't think I've anything to add about the doors.
and then even just happy, like it's interesting with Paula Spencer that, especially in the last book, she'll point out that she's actually happy, and it'll be something very simple, just when she's with her kids.
Yeah, moments. That's
Yeah,
happiness is generally moments, isn't it? I watched a football game. The whole country is still buzzing after it. We beat Hungary 3-2. Um, and it wasn't a great game, but the winning goal was scored in, literally the last few seconds of the match. And that moment, I was so overjoyed. I was like a 10-year-old in front of the TV, watching a goal being scored as a little boy when it meant so much. And I think the whole country was like that. But happiness then is these moments. If the whole, I love going to see football, but if I was happy for throughout the 90 minutes, what happens then when something really good happens? So I'm forcing the analogy, I suppose, but I was asked recently, "Are you happy?" And to a degree, I hate the question because if I say no, it suggests that I'm miserable and I'm not. But am I happy? No. I'm laughing. I'm not. I'm not denying anything huge. I'm not. Life isn't a burden to be dragged along behind me. But I'm happy now and again.
someone said in the chat, happy is so interesting a term. I've replaced it with content, useful,
Yeah,
satisfied.
yeah. Content is that's a good goal. And
Um,
again, big ask, big ask. You can't be content all the time.
and Kate has something she wanted to say. Hi, Kate.
Hi, yeah, hi. Hi, Roddy.
Uh,
I'm Irish.
yeah, so
So,
I did. Did I see your name as Coach?
yeah, coach, yeah. Hi,
Oh, I said it
Yeah.
wrong.
um,
Okay.
Yeah, no, don't worry.
You just
Yeah,
spell it out
delighted.
100 times tonight, Patricia.
Yeah, and you could, but yeah, it's great to be here. And I was wondering, Roddy, like earlier, like The Doors was really interesting, actually. I haven't read the book yet. I've ordered it. I've got the 2 copies here. I'm going to be reading them tonight. But I've read Paddy Clark and I've read Star Called Henry,
Hmm.
but years ago. But uh, you know, the whole thing about like the guilt and the Irish growing up experience about like Catholicism and all of that. But I
Hmm.
wondered, this isn't necessarily for you, Roddy, but it might be more for the group even. But it's that thing of um, like, well, actually, it is for you because it's the Irish experience of the way we brush things under the carpet. Like we are almost experts culturally in hiding things and not facing things. I have felt so for my own personal experience, like I have found it extremely challenging. And just like the last woman who spoke, like I didn't know what I was experiencing until the last couple of years. And this is a 28-year situation. But
Hmm.
I wonder about like Roddy, do you know John McGahern and his books, that are
Yes.
set in the west of Ireland? And that whole cultural sort of just that kind of denying the reality in this
Yeah.
very sort of
Yeah.
understated way that we accept things. And I feel like you touch on that in a different way than John McGahern, but it's a really interesting thing. And I think that is what. So although like you clearly didn't experience domestic violence firsthand, you tapped into something in the culture and in the our experience
Yeah. I
that
don't
brings
know.
these things to life.
I don't know how uniquely Irish it is. We
That's
tend
the thing. Yeah,
we tend to almost take ownership of human qualities and call them really Irish. Going back to the relationship with alcohol, there is a tendency to associate Ireland with alcohol as if no other country in the world uses the stuff
exactly.
or
Exactly. Yeah,
drinks the stuff. Maybe it's the success of Guinness's marketing. I don't know.
exactly.
But I think it's much more complicated than that. And
Absolutely. I agree.
you
Yeah.
just have to go to, last year I was in Canada for a while at various book festivals, and I was listening to native Canadians talking about the experience of institutions being taken into institutions. It
Yeah.
sounded like, you know, an Irish story, except it wasn't. It was Canadian, and I'm sure the same with in the United States, and other places. When I don't want to upset anybody who's religious, but wherever the Catholic Church is, you're going to get these stories, and other churches as well. At the moment in Northern Ireland, it's the Presbyterian Church that's under investigation, So I don't think anybody owns these qualities.
Mm.
But I suppose because I grew up in Ireland, particularly I grew up in Dublin, um, there is a tendency, one of the big frets is that, oh, what'll the neighbours think? And I think it was a big national issue as well, because it's a post-colonial society, and the neighbours, of course, were Britain. And I was often, in my early books, I was lucky to see them made into films, and the language in those films, it's working class, it's very industrial. I remember one of the objections to them was that, oh, the language, what'll they think in Britain when it comes out? As if I should care less, you know. And it's not
Roddy,
the hostility to Britain. So yeah, when I'm writing, I tend to, I'm writing about the people that I know, or I'm right, not necessarily literally, but I'm writing in voices that I know, that I've been listening to for nearly 70 years. Whereas the things I'm writing about, like something as seemingly trivial as a bunch of kids forming a band in my first novel, we don't have a monopoly on that. Now, you too would give it the impression at times that they did because they were so ubiquitous at one point. But kids forming a band is a universal story. It happens all over the world, or kids wanting to form a band. So a lot of the things I write about are, they're about just human beings. They just happen to be Irish.
mm,
So, yeah, we tend to worry about the neighbours a lot, or we did. Uh, but on the other hand, is that not the case in other places?
Well, Roddy, we Finding Our Voices did an event. It was called Men Talking, and actually John Wilson is here, and he moderated it. And there was Scott Denman, but I think he's not here right now. I think he had to leave early, but it was men talking about growing up with abusive fathers. And we did it with the Maine Irish Heritage Center in Portland, Maine. And I remember we were just sitting around a table, and I think it was the director of the Maine Irish Heritage Center. I just asked him about, like you're saying, like the stereotype of Irish as big drinkers, and is that sort of a defining quality that he could, about why, something about that. And he said he feels that the defining quality about the Irish, which can lead to a lot of trauma, is this silence. Like they just don't talk about personal things or things that are deep, and important. But do you feel again that's a stereotype? And can you, Roddy, relate to that at all? Or
I don't know. I think maybe women are better at finding excuses to meet. They find occasions to meet. Book clubs being a case in point. I don't know any man personally in my social circle who's a member of a book club. Not at all.
Interesting. Yeah, women do. Yeah.
Including me. The last thing I want to do really in some ways is join a book club because, I'm all day either reading them or writing them and I don't want to talk about them later on. So, but women are really much better at finding, as I said, excuses to speak. And women who know each other well, they seem to talk. They seem to go into, there's somebody jokingly called it the organ recital, where women and men of a certain age discuss their health first of all. They get that out of the way. What needs mending, what's fallen off, what's breaking, what has to be fixed. And then in the case of men, start talking about football. So yeah, women are much better, I think. I perceive, again, if falling into cliche in a way or falling into stereotyping, but women, I suspect, are better, first of all, at finding excuses to meet, and secondly, talking. Men, Irish men, I'd like to think that younger men are a bit more open, but certainly going back to my schooling, I remember when I was taking that beating, there was 6 of us who were lined up and we were being beaten. And the big thing for me, the only thing that mattered was that I wouldn't cry. 15-year-old boy, it was really important to me that I would not be crying when I was sent back into the classroom. And I didn't. And I was in real severe pain for the rest of the day, but I didn't cry, and in a way it was a triumph. Years later, decades later, I saw a man who looked familiar. I was walking down the street near where I live, and he was standing outside a bank. And he looked familiar, and I knew who it was, and I hadn't seen him since I left school in 1976. And I went up to him and he recognized me and we just started chatting and we swapped email addresses and he got in touch with me, said, "You want to meet for a drink?" And we did. We met for a drink. Within a minute, we started talking about that episode where we'd been hit. And he, before I said it, said the thing that mattered most to me was that I wouldn't cry. And when you grow up with that, when you grow up thinking that you're a man because you didn't cry, even though you had every justification, is there any wonder then that you're a bit silent when you grow up?
True. And Roddy, do you feel that the violence that happened to you as a boy and that was so impactful, could you relate that at all to writing about violence that happened to Paula Spencer?
Yeah, I mean, you draw on experience. You draw on as much experience as you can. And luckily, those beatings, and there weren't many of them, but those beatings in school, they're kind of in the filing cabinet, if you know what I mean. They're there to be used. On a more cheerful note, going back to that football match I was watching, this World Cup football match with Ireland, all the players at the end of it were crying. These kind of warriors who'd gone to Hungary and won the game that they needed to win, they were all crying. And this young lad from the inner city of Dublin, Troy Parrott is his name, who'd scored 3 goals, he was being interviewed, on national TV, and he didn't seem to feel the least bit ashamed that he was crying. And he explained it was the best night of his life, and his family was there, but there was no, it's maybe a generational shift or whatever that you feel joy, you're allowed to cry.
So that's progress.
Grief, you're allowed to cry.
Yeah.
That to me is progress. Yeah. It's yes, that is progress. There's no doubt about that. And I think people are less. This might be just wishful thinking, but I think people are less silent now. I could, I have to qualify that and say the courts are full of cases of, where people did remain silent. So I'm not saying this is a universal fact within the country, but I would imagine, judging by my ears and what I listen to and what I say myself in the company of other men, that men are more open to talking than used to be the case. Do you know?
Yeah. When you are so associated, your Paula Spencer books are so important as far as domestic abuse. Do you find that when you hear about domestic abuse cases happening in Ireland, including Jacqueline Connolly, who wrote the book Deadly Silence, and her sister and 3 nephews were murdered in Ireland. She's going to be on our book club in January. Do you always have an ear out for situations of domestic violence in Ireland?
I suppose I have an ear out for a lot of things. There was a case recently of a man was convicted of murder, but it was years before the woman's his partner. I'm not sure if they were married, but say his partner's body was found. He'd buried it under the stairs in the house, and at first, when the police, the guards, as they're known in Ireland, came to visit the house, they clearly didn't examine it too carefully. Years later, when the investigation was being reopened again, a policewoman, was in the house, and she noticed disparities in the hall between the type of paint that was there, and she asked about it. She saw it. She saw the possibility that something had happened, and they discovered the body, And so I suppose, like everybody, the radio's on in the kitchen, and I'm always half listening, and now and again something really arresting happens. Not necessarily about violence, but say homelessness. I was some years ago listening to the radio, half listening, and I was listening to a young woman describing her day. She had nowhere to live. She was being put up in hotels. The state was paying for hotels, as they're doing with tens of thousands of people now in this country. And her day was she had to get her kids to school. They woke up in a different place every day. She had to bring them to their schools. They were 3 different schools because 3 different ages. She then had to spend the rest of the day trying to find somewhere to stay the next night. And she didn't have time to look for a more permanent place. And then she said, and my partner can't help because he goes to work. And I thought, Christ, they were fulfilling the contract, the social contract. Mm-hmm. Young couple meet, have children. He works. It's an old-fashioned family. He works. She looks after the kids. The only thing missing is a roof over their head. And I thought, there's a story there. So I wrote a film script that was later made into a movie called Rosie, about a homeless woman looking for somewhere to stay for the following night. But that's because I was listening to the radio. So my ears are, not always open. Now and again, I just lean over and turn the radio off, because it's rare enough you hear good news.
Yes.
Particularly at the moment, it's a pretty grim place.
That's true indeed. It is true indeed. And Rachel Louise Snyder, who was on our book club also, No Visible Bruises, she is applying to move to Ireland just because of what's happening in the States.
I'm an Irish woman living in London. And Roddy, I agree with you in lots of ways, in lots of different areas. Yeah, there is progression, definitely. But unfortunately, and I do find this so depressing, that domestic violence is actually on the increase. And I just wonder, what you feel about that.
I don't know what to add. It's awful. I wrote a film about homelessness, and homelessness is on the increase. So creatively we can, make stories. We can make people feel closer to the experience of others. We can get great actors to play the parts. We can write novels, whatever, but it doesn't necessarily have an impact on what is happening. awareness, yeah, but I think COVID and people being locked into crammed places didn't have any, beneficial effect on a lot of people's lives. So also, one thing I would say is that there's an honesty to statistics, so there's an honesty to data collection that might have been absent in the past. So we've catching up to do, if that makes sense.
And
I'm not
also
saying,
the percentage of homeless people who are homeless because of domestic abuse and women are
yeah,
yeah, so that's huge. Diane has a question. Diane Rosenfeld.
I just want to acknowledge the role that you have had in helping women find their voice, which is like completely consonant with what Patricia's work is. But I used to assign the book and then parts of the book to classes on women in the law in Chicago and then later at Harvard Law School, because the voice was so clear and so powerful, and people would read it and say, I'm not alone.
yeah.
And what you've done for so many women around the world is just incredible, and I just want to give you so much love.
Thank you very, very much. I also know that the book has been used, it's a mandatory reading in several medical schools, so that trainee doctors would be more open to looking properly at women in accident and emergency, and maybe women with a drink or alcohol on their breaths, and not to write them off, I think the creative success of the novel is in some ways down to the fact that it would never ever have occurred to me when I was writing it that it would have that kind of life later on, that you, for example, would use it, that medical schools would use it. If I had thought that or known that, I suspect it wouldn't have been as, dare I say it, good. Again, I put on the blinkers and just wrote the novel. The fact that it's used in that way is very gratifying from my point of view. It's really nice. It seems a strange word to use, but it's nice to know. It makes me feel, more than 30 years after I started writing the book, that it still has a life, and that it's a useful life, and that people also read it because they love reading novels, they love fiction. So it's strange when you'd like it that it wouldn't be necessary that people would have to be alerted about violence in the home, but it's there. So it's quite gratifying to know that a novel can be used as a tool in the fight against, and in the exposing of the fact of domestic violence. And again, though, I just reiterate that it wasn't in my head when I was writing the book.
I love the fact that medical schools are using it, because when Diane, I found out that we were going to have you on, and she immediately thought of she quoted, ask me, ask me, ask me, which was Paula was always saying to herself whenever she went to a hospital with her injuries.
Yeah.
And the doctors would never ask her about it. And now it's being taught in medical schools.
Well, I do remember putting those words together, ask me, ask me, ask me, and thinking, there's a musical quality to that. It's a strange thing, but if somebody said that's the name of a song by The Cure from the years and years ago, I think I remember that one, even though it didn't exist. So that's what was going on, granted the urgency, ask me, and people would be saying to themselves, why do you have to ask? Why doesn't she just say it? But it is funny how, we've all encountered experiences where you just ask a question and the answer pours out. So, but the ask me, ask me, ask me, I would have said, the day I put those those two words together 3 times was a good day's work, because it worked dramatically, it worked on the page, it worked creatively, psychologically, all sorts of ways. When I saw that on the page or on the screen, I probably was feeling quite satisfied.
Well, you've made us all very satisfied to be our guest tonight. And I want to thank you so very much for joining
It was
us.
a pleasure. It was a pleasure. It was nice to talk to you. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Roddy.
Can I go now?
Yes, you can go now. Bye-bye.
There's football on the telly.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, enjoy.
No problem. Thanks very
Bye-bye.
much. See you.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much. Bye-bye.
Bye.